My name is John Adams, and I stand before you as one of the men who helped shape this great nation. You may know me as the second President of the United States, or perhaps as a founding father who played a key role in our nation's independence. But today, I hope you will join me not as a historical figure but as a man, a husband, a father, and a servant of this young republic. When we speak of America, we speak of a story that is still being written. From the moment this land was first discovered, it has been a place where ideas of freedom, equality, and self-determination have flourished. But these ideas did not come to fruition on their own. They were born through struggle, sacrifice, and the courage of ordinary men and women who were determined to see them realized. My story is not one of a great man born into privilege, but of a boy born in a modest home in Quincy, Massachusetts, raised with the belief that knowledge was the most powerful tool in the fight for justice. As I look back on my life, I see a journey filled with hard decisions, moments of doubt, but also triumphs, some small, some large, that have left their mark on history. Today, I will take you through the years that shaped me from my early life in New England, to my time at Harvard, to the battles and diplomatic missions that would ultimately lead to the birth of a nation. You will see how I went from a young lawyer in a colonial town to a revolutionary leader, then a statesman, and later, the second President of the United States. Through all of this, I was never alone. My dear wife Abigail, my partner in life and in thought, stood by my side through every challenge. My fellow patriots, those who fought for the cause of liberty, were there with me as we navigated the stormy seas of revolution and the founding of a new country. Through the struggles, the sacrifices, and the triumphs, I have come to realize that what we built here, this American experiment, is not just a political system, but a promise of freedom, of self-governance, of opportunity for every individual. And though my time on this earth is now behind me, I look to the future with hope, knowing that the principles we fought for are still alive today. So, I invite you to walk with me, to understand the world through my eyes, as we begin this journey through the story of my life. The life of an ordinary man who found himself part of something extraordinary. The story of America. Our story begins here, with us, and with the vision of a free people. I was born on September 30th, 1735, in the small town of Quincy, Massachusetts. Back then, Quincy was a peaceful and quiet place, far removed from the hustle and bustle of the cities and the modern world. The land around us was mostly farmland, and life here was simple and unpretentious. My family wasn't wealthy, but we had enough. My father, John Adams Sr., was a farmer, a merchant, and a local leader of sorts. Though he wasn't of noble blood, he had a strong sense of duty and a practical wisdom that he passed down to me. He often said, "Labor is the greatest wealth, and responsibility and diligence are the true measures of a man's character." I understood that my father's way of life was grounded in hard work and responsibility, something I would come to respect deeply. My mother, Susanna, was very different. She was my rock, my refuge, and my first teacher. She wasn't a woman of high social standing, but her intelligence and inner strength were beyond measure. She believed in the power of education, and was determined that her children would never lack knowledge, even if it meant sacrificing her own comforts. Knowledge is the freedom of the soul. Education allows us to choose who we want to be, she would often say. These words stayed with me, while my father focused on practical life, teaching us to work the land, manage a farm, and contribute to the family's well-being. My mother sought to cultivate our minds. I would spend my days working with my father, and my evenings reading by the fire with my mother. It was in these quiet moments that I began to understand the world beyond the farm. My parents may have had different views on life, but they both shared a belief in the value of education and the importance of There was something about books that always drew me in. My family didn't have money to buy new books, but my mother's modest collection was a window into the world. I was particularly drawn to history and philosophy, spending hours absorbed in the writings of ancient Greece and Rome, as well as the works of Shakespeare. I remember feeling as if those pages carried me far beyond the farm in Quincy, to places and ideas I had never even dreamed of. It wasn't just the stories that fascinated me, but the principles of liberty, justice, and freedom that were embedded in those texts. However, life was not always peaceful and filled with books. I spent many long winter nights by the fire, with my father working by the hearth and my mother sewing quietly. Yet, there was always a part of me that felt unsettled, like I was meant for something more than the life I was living. I saw many people in our town, hardworking men and women who labored tirelessly day in and day out. They were good people, but I couldn't help but feel that there had to be more to life than the routine of farm work and trade. It was as if something inside me knew I wasn't meant to spend my days plowing fields or measuring grain. I often asked myself, what can I do to escape this world, to find a place where I can make a real difference? That question stayed with me through my childhood. There was a hunger in my heart, a hunger for something greater, something beyond the familiar hills and fields of Quincy. Though I didn't yet know the path, I knew education would be my way out. My mother's encouragement to follow my dreams kept me going. She always said, no matter how far you go, the world will open up for those who seek it. Her words were a constant source of strength for me. At the age of 16, I made the decision to leave Quincy and pursue an education at Harvard University. Back then, Harvard wasn't the prestigious institution it is today. It was small and traditional, but it represented an opportunity to rise above my humble beginnings and change my fate. I knew it wouldn't be easy. My family couldn't afford to pay for my education, so I would have to work for every penny. But I didn't hesitate. Harvard was my only chance, the only way to escape the confines of Quincy and embrace a broader world. I remember those early days at Harvard. I wasn't like most of my classmates. Many came from wealthy families, able to pay their way with ease. But I struggled to make ends meet, working long hours at odd jobs just to keep myself afloat. Late at night, when everyone else was resting, I'd be in my dorm room, reading by candlelight. My thoughts would often drift back to Quincy, to my family and the simple life I had left behind. I felt the weight of those early sacrifices, but I also knew that they were necessary. If I didn't fight through this adversity, I would never reach the goals I had set for myself. Despite the loneliness and the financial strain, I never wavered in my belief that education was the key to unlocking my future. But Harvard, while providing me with a wealth of ideas, also showed me the harsh reality of life. Many of my classmates were far more privileged than I was, and the world seemed to be stacked against me. There were times when I questioned if I truly belonged there. Yet, every time doubt crept in, I thought of my parents, their sacrifices, their hopes for me, and I pressed on. Harvard shaped me in ways I hadn't anticipated. It broadened my understanding of the world, but it also hardened my resolve. I learned that knowledge was not just an intellectual pursuit, but a tool that could shape the future. It was here that I encountered the ideas of liberty and independence that would fuel my revolutionary spirit in years to come. These ideals, coupled with my mother's lessons on the value of education and self-reliance, became the foundation for everything that followed. By 1765, I had completed my apprenticeship and was practicing law in Braintree, just outside of Quincy. My legal career, though still young, began to take shape. I was not yet well known, but I was deeply committed to my work. I took on every case with passion, understanding that the law, while often slow and cumbersome, was the most powerful tool we had. Yet, it was not just the legal profession that demanded my attention, it was the political landscape around me, which was growing ever more volatile. As the British government imposed one unfair law after another, I began to see my work as a lawyer, not just as a career, but as part of a larger mission. When the Stamp Act was passed in 1765, imposing taxes on all printed materials in the colonies, I was appalled. This was not just taxation, it was an attack on the very liberty of the American people. The law didn't just violate the principles of fairness and representation, it mocked the very idea that the colonists had any say in their own governance. To be taxed without representation was a grave injustice, and I knew that it had to be confronted. I was not alone in my outrage. Across the colonies, people were organizing in resistance to the Stamp Act. The colonies were beginning to feel the weight of British oppression, and it was clear to me that there would be no turning back. It wasn't just the Stamp Act. It was a whole system of colonial rule that had begun to unravel. British authority was overbearing, and the time for polite petitions and speeches had passed. The moment had come to act, to stand firm and demand that the rights of the colonists be respected. It was during this period of growing unrest that I first became involved in politics. In 1770, the Boston Massacre occurred, an event that would forever change the course of my life. When British soldiers opened fire on a crowd of colonists, killing 5, the colony was in an uproar. The people were demanding justice, and many of my fellow patriots called for harsh retribution. It would have been easy to give in to the anger and hatred that swept through the town, but I chose a different path. Despite the public outcry, I agreed to defend the British soldiers in court. My decision was met with intense criticism, even from some of my closest friends. But I did it because I believed in something greater than revenge. I believed that the law had to be impartial, that every man, no matter his station, deserved a fair trial. This was a pivotal moment for me, one that tested my resolve. It was not about the soldiers. It was about the principle of justice. I knew that if we were to build a republic, we had to lay the foundations on fairness and law, not on vengeance and mob rule. The trial was long and difficult, but in the end, I was able to secure acquittals for most of the soldiers. It was a decision that further distanced me from some of my fellow patriots, but I had no regret. I had defended the rule of law, even when it was not popular. The experience taught me that true leadership was not about pandering to the masses, but about doing what was right, even when it was hard. As the years went by, I found myself becoming more deeply involved in the political ferment that was taking place in Massachusetts. I joined the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and worked alongside men like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Joseph Warrenman, whose ideas would shape the future of the nation. We met in secret, planning and discussing how we might oppose British policies. These were dangerous times, and the risk of discovery was ever present. But the cause of liberty was too important for us to back down. In 1774, I was elected as a delegate to the Continental Congress. I knew that this was my chance to take the next step. I had fought in the courts for justice, and now I had the opportunity to fight in the halls of power for the cause of freedom. But my heart was heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. To oppose Britain was no small thing. It meant defying the most powerful empire the world had ever known. It meant risking everything, our homes, our families, our very lives. The journey to independence was not an easy one. The Continental Congress was divided. There were those who still believed that reconciliation with Britain was possible, that we could settle our differences through diplomacy. But I had come to believe that reconciliation was impossible. The British had shown us, time and time again, that they had no intention of respecting our rights. It was clear to me that the only way forward was independence. The colonies had to stand united against tyranny. In the months that followed, I worked tirelessly in the Continental Congress, advocating for independence, but it was a long and difficult fight. There were moments of doubt, moments when it seemed like the road ahead would be impossible to walk. But I knew that there was no turning back. If we did not stand up for our rights, we would forever be enslaved by a foreign power. As the situation grew more dire, Abigail and I corresponded frequently, her letters a source of solace and strength for me. She was my equal, my partner in every sense, and her words encouraged me to keep fighting for what I believed in. She too was committed to the cause of liberty, and though she was far from the front lines, her influence on me was profound. We would often debate the best course of action, and her wisdom helped shape many of my decisions. On the 19th of April, 1775, the sounds of gunfire in Lexington and Concord rang out like thunder across the colonies. In that moment, I felt a weight that was both crushing and resolute. We had long hoped that we could resolve our issues with Britain through peaceful negotiations, through petitions, and even through legal means. But all those hopes were shattered by the sudden eruption of battle. In the face of this violence, we could no longer pretend that we could avoid the inevitable. War had become our destiny. Even then, I still remember the sensation of outrage and helplessness that came with that first volley. It was as if everything we had endured until that point, our frustrations, our sacrifices, had reached their breaking point. For so long, we had tried to reason with Britain, to make our voices heard through legal and political channels. But that day, we knew there was no turning back. The British had fired upon us, and we had to fight for our future. No more petitions, no more pleas for mercy. It was time to stand up for our rights as free men and women, to fight for independence. Though I had always believed that our struggle would be fought politically. Through debates and diplomatic measures, the sound of the cannon fire showed me that it would also be a war of arms. The colonies were no longer able to hide behind the facade of negotiation. We had to confront the reality of revolution. The fight for independence was no longer a distant dream. It was now a necessity, a fight we could no longer avoid. As the war unfolded, I became more entrenched in the political workings of the Continental Congress. Though we faced pressure to reconcile, I knew in my heart that there could be no peace with Britain. The war was not a mere territorial dispute. It was a fight for our sovereignty. Every discussion in the Continental Congress seemed like an urgent call to action, as though time was running out and the future of our nation hung in the balance. There were those who still sought a peaceful resolution, who thought we could somehow come to terms with the Crown. But for me, that was no longer an option. Britain had made it clear that they would not respect our rights. The only path forward was independence. Then came the drafting of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Jefferson's words rang true to every fiber of my being. When I read the first draft, I knew that it was not just a declaration of our political freedom. It was a declaration of our moral and philosophical stance. It was not just a political move, it was a statement to the world, declaring that we, the people of the American colonies, would no longer be subjects of a distant monarch, but free and equal citizens of our own nation. Yet, passing the declaration was not an easy task. While many were on board with the idea of independence, the reality of what it meant to a complete break from Britain was a daunting prospect. It meant war, it meant loss, it meant sacrifice. But I had already made up my mind. We could not afford to look back. To truly be free, we had to sever all ties with the British Empire. Every day that we delayed, we risked losing our chance at true independence. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was passed. It was a moment of triumph, but also one of incredible responsibility. I knew that this act would set in motion a war of unparalleled scale. We were not simply announcing that we would no longer be a part of the British Empire. We were declaring to the world that we were prepared to stand alone, to fight, to sacrifice everything for the promise of liberty. In the following months, my role in the revolution expanded. I was no longer just a lawyer or a politician. I had become a voice of the revolution itself. Continental Congress meetings became a whirlwind of strategy, decision-making, and compromise. There was never a shortage of difficult decisions. Some of the greatest minds of the time gathered together in pursuit of a common cause, and yet, we often found ourselves at odds. But the question of independence was clear to me. No matter the cost, it had to happen. We could not go back to the way things were. Our future demanded it. As the revolution progressed, it became clear that the road ahead would be long and fraught with hardship. Even after the victory at Saratoga in 1777, there was no guarantee of success. Our troops were underfed and ill-equipped, the morale of the army was low, and we had yet to secure enough support from other nations. France, though willing to assist us, was not yet fully committed to the cause. The British, on the other hand, had the most powerful military in the world, and our ragtag army had little more than their grit to offer. Every victory felt like a fleeting moment of light in a sea of darkness. The cost of war was staggering. Each victory was tainted by the losses we endured, men fallen on the battlefield, families shattered by grief, and homes burned to the ground. As we continued to battle, I found myself more deeply questioning whether we could ever truly succeed. Would the sacrifice be worth it? Would we emerge victorious? Through all the pain and doubt, the letters from Abigail remained my guiding light. She was not only my wife, but my most trusted confidant. Her words kept me grounded when the weight of the revolution threatened to crush me. Her letters spoke of resilience, hope, and the future we were building, not just for ourselves, but for the generations to come. She constantly reminded me that the struggle we were in was not just for our own freedom, but for the freedom of all mankind. In her letters, she would say things like, "You fight not just for us, but for all those who long to be free." And it was in those moments that I would find the strength to keep going. 1777 marked a turning point in our struggle. While the Saratoga victory was a much-needed morale boost, it was still far from the end of our troubles. The soldiers were tired, the people were exhausted, and the strain on the American economy was unbearable. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, we continued to fight. France's eventual recognition of our independence and their commitment to supporting our cause helped turn the tide. But even then, victory seemed distant. I knew that to win, we had to outlast the British, to endure the hardships that lay ahead. By the time we reached the winter of 1777 to 1778, things were looking dire. The Continental Army had endured a grueling winter at Valley Forge. The soldiers were cold, hungry, and near despair, yet they stayed. This was the heart of the revolution. The very soul of the American spirit was formed in that freezing camp. They stayed not because they were forced to, but because they believed in the cause. I had to believe too. It was not enough to survive. We had to prevail. Every challenge we faced was a step toward the future we dreamed of, a future where freedom, equality, and justice would flourish. The year 1778 marked a crossroads in our struggle for independence. The early victories in the war had given us hope, but as the years wore on, the challenges began to mount. Not only were we facing one of the world's most powerful militaries, but we were also battling internal dissent, a fractured colonial economy, and an exhaustion that ran deep in the hearts of the people. The road ahead seemed uncertain, and every victory felt like it was followed by a setback that threatened to undo the progress we had made. But still, we pressed forward. In the spring of 1778, after the long and brutal winter at Valley Forge, something shifted. The soldiers, exhausted and malnourished, emerged from the depths of that suffering, not just as warriors, but as symbols of the American spirit. The conditions at Valley Forge were grueling. Many soldiers had no proper clothing. Others were starving, and sickness spread like wildfire. But despite all this, they stayed. Their loyalty to the cause was unwavering, and this resilience became the foundation of our Revolutionary Army. It was no longer just a military force. It had become a symbol of the ideals we were fighting for: freedom, independence, and justice. Despite our indomitable spirit, we faced constant setbacks. The British, though weakened, were still a formidable enemy. They were well equipped and disciplined, and their navy ruled the seas. In contrast, our resources were limited, our army often undertrained, and the colonies were deeply divided. The hope we had after our early victories seemed to fade with each passing month as we continued to struggle. Yet the French, ever the rivals of Britain, came to our aid. Their involvement provided a much-needed boost, and it gave us hope that perhaps we weren't as alone as we once felt. The French brought with them much-needed naval support, weapons, and military expertise. But their involvement came with its own complexities. Their goal was not solely to aid in our independence. They had their own ambitions in mind. French diplomacy was tricky, and my time in France would soon become one of the most challenging aspects of my career. In 1779, I was sent across the Atlantic to represent the American cause in Paris. The task seemed straightforward enough: secure French aid and bolster their support for the revolution. However, the reality was far more complicated. The French had their own geopolitical interests, and they viewed this as a chance to weaken their longtime adversary, Britain. Their motivations weren't purely altruistic. They wanted to ensure their influence over the new nation once independence was achieved. I found myself in delicate negotiations, not only trying to secure support for the war, but also ensuring that America's future was not dictated by foreign powers. The French court, while sympathetic to our cause, was deeply involved in their own complex set of political and military considerations. While they supported our fight for independence, they also sought to use it as leverage against Britain, hoping to reshape the balance of power in Europe. I had to navigate this tricky political terrain, ensuring that while we sought their support, our sovereignty as a nation would never be compromised. I could not allow America to become a pawn in the struggle between European powers. Every day was a delicate balancing act, and my mind was constantly filled with doubt. Would France remain committed to our cause? Would they try to extract too many concessions once the war was won? The hardest part of being so far from home was the loneliness. Abigail and the children were thousands of miles away, and I was consumed by the weight of my duties in France. The letters I received from Abigail became my anchor. She spoke of the struggles at home, of the burdens of war, but always with strength. Her words were a reminder of what I was fighting for: my family, my country, and the freedom of the American people. But the distance between us also made me keenly aware of the emotional toll this revolution was taking on us all. How long could we continue at this pace? How long could we endure the uncertainty? The negotiations with France dragged on, and the future seemed ever more uncertain. But in 1781, after years of struggle, the war turned in our favor. The British were finally cornered at Yorktown, Virginia, where General Cornwallis found himself trapped between American and French forces. The combined strength of our army and the French navy proved decisive, and Cornwallis was forced to surrender. It was a victory that seemed almost too good to be true. After so many years of hardship and bloodshed, we had won a decisive battle, and with it, our independence seemed a reality. Yet, even as the British surrendered, I knew that the hard work was far from over. The victory at Yorktown did not end the war. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter. The colonies were in ruin. The economy was shattered, the infrastructure in tatters, and the social fabric of our society was deeply strained. We had fought for our independence, but now we had to build a nation from the ground up. The challenges of governing a young republic seemed almost insurmountable. How would we create a government that reflected our ideals of freedom and justice? How would we unite the colonies, each with its own interests, into a cohesive whole? As the peace negotiations began, I found myself again at the heart of the process. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, officially recognized American independence, but it was not a moment of celebration. It was a moment of reflection. We had achieved our goal, but the path ahead was still unclear. The new nation would need to rebuild, and it would need to do so with a government that was just as revolutionary as the struggle for independence itself. The Articles of Confederation, our first attempt at governance, were woefully inadequate. They provided no real means of enforcing laws, no effective way to manage the country's debt, and no central authority to unite the states. The government, in its current form, was too weak to function. It became increasingly clear that we needed a new framework, a constitution that would balance power between the states and the federal government while preserving the liberties we have fought so hard to achieve. By 1787, I was deeply involved in the discussions that would lead to the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. The debates were fierce, and the stakes could not have been higher. The nation was at a crossroads, and the decisions we made would determine its future. Some of us feared a strong central government, while others feared the anarchy that could result from too much decentralization. We knew that we had to strike a balance, and we knew that the work of creating a more perfect union would require compromise, patience, and wisdom. The Constitutional Convention was a crucible in which the future of the United States was forged. We debated, we compromised, and we crafted a document that would serve as the backbone of the new nation. When the Constitution was adopted in 1789, I felt a sense of accomplishment, but also the heavy weight of responsibility. We had won our independence, but now we had to prove that we could govern ourselves. The real test was not in our victory over Britain, it was in how we would govern the country we had fought to create. When George Washington was elected the first president of the United States, I was appointed as vice president. This was an extraordinary moment, but one that came with immense responsibility. The new government was fragile, and we were still navigating the complexities of our new system. Our nation was young, its future uncertain, and I found myself constantly asking, could we overcome the divisions that remained between the states? Could we create a government that would endure, one that would truly reflect the ideals of freedom and equality that had driven the revolution? Under Washington's leadership, the foundation of the new republic was laid. But it was clear that the work was far from finished. We had fought for independence, but now we had to fight for the future. The challenges of governing a new nation, balancing state rights with federal authority, managing economic growth, securing international relations were immense. Yet I was hopeful. We had created something unprecedented, a government by the people, for the people. And though the road ahead would be difficult, I believed in the promise of the United States. The revolution had not been just a fight for independence. It had been the beginning of an experiment in self-government that would change the world. By 1790, the United States stood at a crossroads. We had secured our independence through immense sacrifice. But the hard work of building a nation, one that could endure and fulfill the promises of liberty, justice, and self-governance was still ahead of us. The war against Britain had been a battle for our freedom, but now the question was, could we sustain that freedom? Could we build a system of government that was both strong enough to hold the nation together and yet flexible enough to protect the very rights we had fought for? As vice president under George Washington, I was tasked with helping to answer that question. Washington's presidency was unlike anything that had come before. We were essentially creating the very idea of a republic as we went along. There was no blueprint for this experiment, and every decision we made felt monumental. Washington's leadership, his steadfastness, and his commitment to the idea of a unified nation were essential. But I knew that the road ahead would be paved with challenges. As vice president, my role was mostly ceremonial at first, but it grew to encompass much more. The debates within Washington's cabinet were fierce, particularly between two men who had very different visions for the future of the nation, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton, a visionary in many ways, saw a strong central government as essential to securing the nation's future. He pushed for policies that would elevate the power of the federal government, like the creation of a national bank, a national debt, and a standing army, all of which he argued would give us the tools to defend ourselves and manage our economy effectively. He believed that a central government capable of controlling the nation's finances would lead to a strong, modern, industrialized America. Jefferson, on the other hand, represented the agrarian vision, believing that the United States should remain primarily a republic of small farmers and local communities. He was deeply suspicious of centralized power and feared that Hamilton's economic plans would concentrate too much wealth and authority in the hands of a few, creating an aristocracy similar to the British monarchy. Jefferson's vision was of a decentralized government, with most power residing with the states and the people. The division between Hamilton and Jefferson was not just political, it was philosophical, pitting federalism against republicanism, the desire for a strong central government against the defense of individual liberty and states' rights. After months of debate, the question of the national bank came to a head in 1791. Hamilton's plan for the bank was to create a strong central financial institution that could help stabilize the fledgling economy, facilitate trade, and establish a uniform currency. Jefferson and I, however, felt that this was an overreach by the federal government. The Constitution, we argued, did not grant explicit authority to the government to create such an institution. To us, the national bank seemed to be a step toward consolidating power and undermining the very principles of limited government that we held dear. The debate was intense. In the end, Washington sided with Hamilton, and the bank was established. I found it difficult to accept, but I recognized that Hamilton's vision for a strong national government was beginning to shape the very framework of the country. We had won our independence from Britain, but now we were on the verge of creating something else, a new kind of nation that combined elements of both monarchy and democracy. The decisions we made in those early years would echo throughout the history of the nation. By 1793, our foreign relations had become increasingly complex. The French Revolution had inspired many of us, but its violent turn had left the new French government unstable and unpredictable. Meanwhile, Britain, still angry over our rebellion, continued to harass our shipping, and their influence in the Caribbean remained a constant threat to our interests. The French, desperate for American support, sought to involve us in their war with Britain, but I knew that entering into European conflicts was a dangerous proposition. We were still a fragile nation, and we needed to avoid becoming embroiled in European power struggles. The question of neutrality was one that plagued my administration. In 1793, I declared a policy of neutrality, which meant that we would not take sides in the wars between Britain and France. The decision was not without its detractors. Many, particularly those sympathetic to the French cause, criticized the policy, believing that we owed France our support after they had helped us during our revolution. But I stood firm. We were a young nation, and we could not afford to be drawn into a conflict that would risk our survival. Despite my efforts to maintain neutrality, the XYZ affair, which involved French officials demanding bribes in exchange for negotiating with the United States, further strained relations with France. The affair caused an uproar in America, and calls for war with France grew louder. But I remained committed to peace. Our country was too young, too fragile, to engage in war. Instead, I pursued diplomatic efforts that eventually led to the Treaty of Mortefontaine in 1800, which ended the hostilities between the two nations. However, while the threat of war with France receded, our internal divisions grew sharper. By the late 1790s, the United States had become a deeply polarized nation. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, had come to dominate the national government, but their vision of a strong central government and a close relationship with Britain increasingly alienated the public. In contrast, the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson, began to build a powerful opposition that was gaining ground in both the public sphere and in Congress. By 1798, the political tensions between the two parties had reached a boiling point. The Federalists, worried about foreign influence and domestic dissent, passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. These laws gave the government broad powers to deport foreigners and to arrest those who criticized the government. While the acts were intended to protect the nation from foreign interference, they were widely seen as an attempt to silence political opposition and limit free speech. The acts were particularly unpopular with Jefferson and his allies, who saw them as a direct threat to the First Amendment and the democratic principles we had fought for. I supported the Alien and Sedition Acts, not because I wanted to curtail freedoms, but because I believed they were necessary to protect the nation's security during a time of political instability. I believed the acts were a temporary measure, but they sparked a fierce backlash. The opposition was fierce, and many saw them as a dangerous overreach of federal power. The political fallout was severe. The Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison, launched a series of attacks on my administration, and public sentiment began to turn against the Federalists. Despite these internal challenges, I continued to push for policies that I believed were essential for the survival of the young republic. The quasi-war with France was averted, but tensions with the Democratic Republicans continued to grow. In the election of 1800, my Federalist vision of a strong central government was repudiated by the electorate. Thomas Jefferson, my former ally, won the presidency, and I was defeated. The election of 1800, often referred to as the Revolution of 1800, marked a turning point in American history. It was the first peaceful transfer of power from one political party to another, a testament to the strength of the republic and the principles of democracy. Though I had lost the election, I was proud that we had established a precedent for the peaceful transition of power, key principle of our government that would endure for generations. Leaving the presidency was a difficult decision, but I knew that my time had passed. The country had changed, and the vision of the Federalists was no longer in alignment with the direction in which the nation was headed. But I did not retreat from public life. I remained an active participant in the political discourse of the nation, offering my views on the direction of the country and the challenges it faced. In many ways, I became a voice of experience, one who had helped shape the foundation of the United States. As I entered the later stages of my life, I found myself constantly reflecting on the remarkable yet troubled journey that our new nation had taken. The revolution had been the forge in which our independence was won, but the true test was always going to be what came after. Freedom from Britain was only the beginning. Now the real work had begun, creating a stable government, keeping the republic together, and making sure that the promises of liberty and equality were not lost in the struggles of nation building. When I left the presidency in 1801, I felt a mixture of relief and unease. The country was in the hands of Thomas Jefferson, a man with whom I had worked closely in the Revolution, but whose political vision had diverged significantly from mine. He represented the new ideals of a republic that emphasized agrarian simplicity, limited government, and a strict interpretation of the Constitution. I, on the other hand, had been a proponent of a strong central government, one that could unite the states and manage the complexities of an emerging global economy. The United States was not the same place it had been in 1776. The nation had grown in population, in size, and in complexity. We had expanded westward, and with each new state, there were new challenges to our fragile union. The divisiveness between the political parties had also deepened. The Federalists, who had been dominant in the early years of the Republic, were increasingly sidelined by Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. While I respected Jefferson's intellect and many of his ideas, I also saw the dangers in what he proposed. A nation where the central government was weak, where states held too much power, and where the principles of the revolution could easily be lost in the shuffle of party politics. The growing animosity between the political factions only highlighted the fragility of the new nation. It was becoming increasingly clear that our government was not yet fully settled. Could the United States survive as a republic? Could we protect our independence while also respecting the complexities of governance? My experiences in office had made me deeply aware of the dangers of partisanship, but also of the need for a strong, unified government to hold the nation together. Yet, as Jefferson's vision took hold, I began to fear that the ideals of the revolution, particularly those regarding a balanced, centralized government, were in jeopardy. During this time, I maintained regular correspondence with Jefferson, despite our political differences. Our letters, though often politically charged, were filled with mutual respect. We had both been committed to the principles of the revolution, but we had come to different conclusions about what those principles required in practice. Jefferson's views on the federal government's role were vastly different from mine, and as the years went on, I found myself becoming more and more concerned about the direction he was taking the nation. His commitment to states' rights seemed to open the door to a level of fragmentation that could tear the republic apart. As I grew older, I spent much of my time contemplating the long-term consequences of the decisions we had made. One of the greatest disappointments I had was the persistence of slavery in the United States. I had hoped, as many of us had, that slavery would fade away over time, that it would be seen for the moral and economic disaster it was, and that future generations would be appalled by it. Yet, even as I watched the nation grow, I saw how entrenched the institution of slavery had become. It was as if we had built a republic on the promise of liberty, but had left a deep moral wound unaddressed. I had spoken out against slavery for years, and I had hoped that the revolution's ideals would lead to its eventual abolition. Yet, the reality was that slavery was growing stronger in the South, becoming a defining feature of the Southern economy. I feared that this moral contradiction would tear the country apart. As new states were admitted to the Union, the question of whether they would allow slavery became a central issue. It was a ticking time bomb, and I began to believe that it would take a civil war to end it once and for all. It was a bitter truth that I had to live with in my later years. The deeper I thought about these issues, the more I saw the revolution as both a blessing and a curse. The ideals of liberty, equality, and justice that we had fought for were noble, but they had not been fully realized. The founding of the United States had created a republic based on these principles, but the reality of governing that republic was far more complicated. The compromises we had made, particularly over slavery, were weighing heavily on my conscience. Would the United States ever truly live up to the ideals of the revolution, or were we merely papering over our deepest flaws? I had always believed that the strength of a nation came from its ability to adapt, to change, and to confront its flaws. The Constitution itself was a living document, one that had been shaped by the realities of the moment. But even the Constitution, for all its brilliance, was not perfect. It had allowed for the continuation of slavery, a deeply regrettable flaw that would, I feared, come to haunt the Republic. The Electoral College, which we had established to protect smaller states, seemed to me an outdated institution, one that allowed for too much inequality in the selection of our leaders. The very framework we had built was not set in stone. It could evolve, but only if the people had the courage to confront its imperfections. But as I watched the growth of the country and the changing political landscape, I began to see that the United States, despite its flaws, was still a remarkable experiment in democracy. The nation was still young, still learning how to reconcile its ideals with its realities. The question, I realized, was not whether we had created a perfect nation, but whether we could build a more perfect union over time. The War of 1812 was a test of that idea. Though I was no longer in office, I watched with interest as the United States found itself once again at war with Britain. The war, in many ways, was a reflection of the challenges we faced as a young nation. We were still struggling to define our place in the world, to assert our sovereignty, and to protect our interests. The war was hard fought, and though it ended in a relative stalemate, It proved that the United States could defend itself, that it could stand on its own in the face of foreign threats. The outcome of the War of 1812 gave me a sense of cautious optimism. The United States was still here, still standing, and still working to define its place in the world. But I knew that the Republic was far from secure. The internal divisions remained, and the issue of slavery was only becoming more pressing. The road ahead was uncertain, but I had come to believe that the American experiment in democracy had the potential to succeed. If we could remain true to the principles of liberty and equality, and if we could find a way to address the moral failures that still haunted the nation. As I neared the end of my life, I reflected on the many decisions, both political and personal, that had shaped the nation and my own legacy. I had been a part of something much larger than myself, something that would outlast me and my generation. The work of the revolution was not finished. It was ongoing, and it would be carried forward by future generations. My part in it was complete, but I believed that the United States had the capacity to continue the work we had begun. I took solace in the knowledge that, even in our darkest hours, the American experiment could still be salvaged. The principles we had fought for in 1776, freedom, equality, and justice would continue to resonate, even as we struggled with their full realization. The United States was, and would continue to be, a beacon of hope for all those who longed for liberty and a government accountable to the people. The work of the revolution was never finished, but it was worth pursuing. As my days stretched into the later years of my life, I found myself increasingly consumed by thoughts of the republic we had forged, this fragile, young experiment in democracy. From the moment of independence, I had been involved in the great project of building a new kind of nation, one founded on the principles of liberty, equality, and self-governance. Yet, as I neared the end of my life, I could not escape the nagging question: had we built something that could truly endure? Had we created a nation capable of realizing the lofty ideals for which we had fought? As I spent more time in quiet reflection, the enormity of what we had set in motion began to sink in. It had been more than a half-century since the first shots of the revolution had been fired at Lexington and Concord. The revolution, which had begun as a fight for independence, had morphed into something far grander: battle for the principles of freedom and self-determination. But even in the early days of our independence, I knew that the work was far from over. The establishment of a nation based on democratic ideals was not the end of the struggle, it was just the beginning. The questions that weighed most heavily on my mind in those final years were not about foreign policy, nor were they about military victories or defeats. No. What troubled me the most was the very soul of the Republic, the internal challenges we had faced since the founding. Would we be able to preserve the Union? Could we, as a young and diverse nation, hold together in the face of internal division? These questions were not hypothetical to me. They were deeply personal, for I had been a witness to and participant in the creation of this republic, and I now found myself anxious about its future. When I left the presidency in 1801, I hoped that the new administration under Jefferson would build upon the foundations we had laid. I respected Jefferson as a fellow patriot, and I admired his vision of a republic of agrarian simplicity. Yet, over time, I grew concerned that his approach might weaken the central authority of the federal government, and in doing so, endanger the very unity of the states. Jefferson's ideal of a limited government, with power returned to the states, seemed to me to be an invitation to fragmentation. I had fought so hard for a strong federal government, one capable of uniting the states in defense of liberty. How could this new government survive if it lacked the power to maintain national cohesion? However, despite my concerns, I recognized that change was inevitable. The political landscape of the United States was shifting, and political parties were now becoming the dominant force in shaping our government. The shift from the Federalists, who championed a strong national government, to the Democratic Republicans, who sought more autonomy for states, highlighted the growing divisions within our society. I feared that these divisions could soon lead to a political schism, one that could undermine the very ideals of the revolution. Looking back at the bitter partisan struggles of my presidency, I realized how easily the seeds of division had been planted. The intensity of the political debates had revealed deep fault lines in our young republic. The challenges we faced are differing visions of the role of government. The relationship between states and the central authority were not just theoretical debates. They were fundamental questions that would determine the very survival of the nation. How could we sustain unity in such a politically divided nation? How could we ensure that our democracy would not descend into chaos? I had always been wary of factionalism. It was clear to me that political parties were an inevitable byproduct of a free society, but I had hoped that their influence would be limited. It troubled me, in my later years, to see how deeply ingrained political parties had become in our national life. The battle between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans was not just about policy, it was about the soul of the nation. What kind of government would the United States become? Would we remain a republic that valued democratic principles, or would we succumb to the forces of partisanship and factionalism? Beyond the issue of internal division, another question continued to haunt me. What about the moral contradictions within the republic? The greatest contradiction, of course, was the existence of slavery. How could we, as a nation, founded on the principle that all men are created equal, continue to enslave millions of human beings? I had long hoped that slavery would die out on its own, that over time the moral imperative of freedom would become undeniable. But as I grew older, I could see that slavery was only growing more entrenched. The South had built its entire economy around slavery, and I feared that this moral blight would eventually bring the nation to the brink of destruction. I tried to speak out against it, but the political forces in the South were too powerful. The debate over slavery was not just a question of morality, it was a question of power. Slavery was a deeply political issue, and its defenders would stop at nothing to protect it. I knew that the issue would not be resolved easily, and I began to fear that the failure to address it would eventually tear the republic apart. The question of slavery, in my view, was the defining issue for the United States. It was not just a moral failure, it was a constitutional one. The very foundation of our nation, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution had been built on the promise of equality and liberty. But as long as slavery persisted, that promise could never be fully realized. The contradiction was too glaring, too undeniable. How could we continue to proclaim the principles of freedom and equality while simultaneously enslaving a large portion of our population? The more I thought about it, the more I believed that slavery would be the issue that would ultimately bring about the downfall of the republic. Despite these fears, I did not give up hope. I knew that the United States had great potential. We had fought a revolution to create a republic based on the idea of liberty, and we had succeeded. We had built a government that was capable of responding to the needs of a growing nation, even though it was still in its early stages. The Constitution, for all its imperfections, was a living document, one that could evolve as the needs of the nation evolved. The key, I believed, was not to abandon the revolution's ideals, but to keep pushing forward, to keep striving to make the republic more just, more equitable. I had long believed that the United States could be a beacon for the world. If we could succeed in building a nation based on democratic principles, we could offer hope to other nations struggling under the weight of tyranny. But the future of our republic was not guaranteed. The moral challenges we faced, the issue of slavery, the political divisions, the growing tensions between North and South were not easily resolved. But I held on to the belief that the United States had the potential to become the nation we had always dreamed of, if we had the courage to confront the challenges before us. As I reflected on my life, I realized that the United States, despite its flaws, was still an extraordinary experiment. We had created a nation based on ideals that had never before been tested in the way we tested them. We had shown the world that a government could be founded on the consent of the governed, that a people could come together and create a government that reflected their will. But that government, I knew, was still fragile. It would take the work of generations to build a more perfect union, to realize the full promise of the revolution. I took comfort in the fact that the work of the revolution was not complete. It had never been just about winning a war. It had always been about creating a nation where freedom, equality, and justice were the guiding principles. And though the journey was far from over, I believed that the future of the United States was worth fighting for. I was proud of what we had accomplished, but I knew that much remained to be done. The struggle for justice, for equality, for the fulfillment of the promise of liberty, would continue. As I approached the end of my life, I felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that I had played a part in this great experiment. The United States would endure, and with each passing year it would grow stronger, more just, and more capable of living up to the ideals of the revolution. But it would require the dedication of every generation to keep that flame alive. As the days slipped away, the sense of finality grew ever closer, yet there was a stillness in my heart that had eluded me during my years of service. It wasn't a fear of death that gripped MIT, it was a realization that I had lived through the most monumental years in the history of this nation. I had helped shape it, fought for it, and watched it grow. I was now on the cusp of departure. But I took solace in the knowledge that the United States was more than just a collection of men. It was an idea, a vision of freedom that had transcended my own existence. The revolution we fought for was not just about breaking free from tyranny. It was about the creation of a system where people could govern themselves, a system that would forever change the course of history. It was founded on the principles of liberty, justice, and equality. But even as I lay on my deathbed, I knew that these principles had not been fully realized. The nation was still young, still maturing, still grappling with the contradictions it had inherited. As I lay there reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point, I thought about the challenges that had faced our fledgling republic. We had fought a bitter war for independence, and in the aftermath, we had been forced to confront the complexities of building a new government. We had weathered the storm of revolution, and I had fought for the creation of a national government strong enough to hold the republic together. I had seen firsthand the risks of disunity of a government too weak to preserve the gains we had made. And yet, even as I grew older and my health faltered, I could still feel the weight of that responsibility. The issue of slavery continued to plague me in my final years, and I could not shake the feeling that it was a moral and political time bomb. We had fought for liberty, but how could we reconcile that with the continued existence of slavery? How could we claim to stand for freedom when millions of men and women were held in bondage? It was a question that had haunted me for years, and as I grew older, I became increasingly convinced that the institution of slavery would one day destroy the very republic we had fought to create. Yet, I also recognized that this was not a battle I could win alone. I had spent much of my life trying to find a way to reconcile the ideals of liberty with the reality of slavery, but I could not solve the issue on my own. It would fall to the future generations of Americans to address it, to find the way to heal the wounds of our nation, and to fulfill the promise of liberty for all. I could only hope that the nation would find the courage and wisdom to confront this moral crisis, and to do so in a way that would preserve the unity of the republic. Though I feared for the future, I also found a sense of pride in what we had accomplished. The United States was not perfect, but it had become a beacon of hope for the world. In the years since the revolution, we had fought to build a government that could be accountable to the people, a government that could preserve their rights and protect their freedoms. And while there were still many challenges ahead, I believed that the republic could survive them if it remained true to the principles on which it was founded. Looking back on my life, I saw the progress we had made: the establishment of the rule of law, the creation of a democratic government, the expansion of the nation across the continent. We had built something extraordinary, something that had the potential to change the course of history. But I also knew that this was just the beginning. The true test of the United States would not be in the wars it fought or the land it acquired, but in its ability to live up to the ideals of freedom and equality. The work of the revolution would never be finished. As I neared the end, I thought of the young men and women who would take up the mantle of leadership. I thought of my own son, John Quincy Adams, and the challenges he would face in his own time. The future of the republic was in their hands now. The question was not whether the United States would continue to grow; it already had. The question was whether it would remain true to the principles of liberty, justice, and equality. The struggle for these ideals would continue, but I had faith that future generations would rise to meet the challenges of their time. In my final days, I thought often of the great leaders of the Revolution: George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton, men whose courage and vision had made the United States possible. Each of us had played a role in the founding of the nation, and each of us had made sacrifices for the cause. I was proud of what we had accomplished together, but I knew that the work was far from over. The future of the nation would depend on the ability of its leaders and its people to continue the work of the revolution. There were still dark clouds on the horizon, political factions that threatened to tear the nation apart, the unresolved issue of slavery that cast a shadow over everything we had fought for. But I also believed that the strength of the American people lay in their ability to come together in times of crisis. The nation had survived its early trials, and I had no doubt that it could survive whatever challenges lay ahead. In my final reflections, I thought about the world that was watching us. The United States had become a symbol of hope for the oppressed, a model for those who longed for freedom. But the world was also watching to see if our experiment in democracy would succeed or fail. If we failed, it would not just be a loss for us, it would be a loss for the cause of liberty worldwide. But if we succeeded, we would show the world that a government by the people, for the people, could work. I had always believed in the greatness of the American people, and as I faced the end of my life, I was confident that the United States would continue to rise to the occasion. It had been a long, hard road, but we had built a republic that had the potential to last for centuries. The work was not over, but it had been set on the right course. The United States was an experiment, a living document, and though there would be many hurdles ahead, I believed that the experiment would say. As I took my final breaths, I knew that the nation was in good hands. The ideals of liberty, equality, and self-government would continue to guide the American people. And though I would not be there to see it, I had no doubt that the republic would endure. I had played my part, and now it was time for others to carry the torch. The United States would continue to grow, to learn from its mistakes, and to fulfill the promise of the revolution. And so, with a sense of peace, I passed from this world, knowing that the work of the revolution was far from finished, but that the foundations had been laid. The struggle for liberty would continue, but the United States was born for greatness. And that, I believed, was a legacy of our work, a nation that could stand as a beacon for all the world, a shining example of what a republic could be. As the final days of my life unfolded, I found my thoughts turning more and more to the nature of the nation I had helped bring into existence. The United States was still young, still struggling to define itself, and yet it was already a beacon of hope to the world. We had fought for the ideal of a republic based on liberty and justice, and though I believed in the strength of our foundations, I knew that the republic was not yet immune from the forces of corruption and tyranny. The real test, I believed, would come not in the wars we fought or the victories we won, but in the way the republic would adapt to its ever-changing challenges. In my final hours, I saw more clearly than ever that the work we had begun was unfinished. The revolution we had waged had been about far more than just political independence. It had been about establishing a nation where men were free, where they could govern themselves, and where the principles of liberty could be protected for generations to come. It was an experiment in the truest sense of the word, an attempt to see whether a nation could be built, not on the whims of monarchs or aristocrats, but on the will of the people themselves. But as I lay there, I could not deny the many contradictions that had shaped the United States. We had won our independence from an empire that imposed its will on us. And yet the practice of slavery continued in the very republic we had founded. How could we claim to stand for liberty when millions were still enslaved? How could we call ourselves a government of the people when the voices of so many were silenced? The question of slavery weighed heavily on me, and as I grew older, I became more and more convinced that it was a moral and political crisis that would ultimately threaten the unity of the nation. I feared that we had created a republic that was not capable of healing its own wounds. We had fought for independence, but we had not yet fought for justice. The moral contradiction of slavery was something I could not ignore. We had laid the foundations of a government founded on equality, and yet millions of men and women remained in bondage. I believed that unless this issue was addressed, Unless the United States came to terms with its own moral failings, it would be torn apart. I did not know when or how it would happen, but I feared that the very unity of the Republic was in jeopardy. At the same time, I took comfort in the fact that we had accomplished something truly extraordinary. The United States was the first nation in history to be founded on the principle of popular sovereignty, that the people, not kings or tyrants, would determine their own fate. We had established a government based on the rule of law, one that enshrined the rights of individuals and protected their liberties. That, I believed, was an achievement that would endure, even if the road ahead was fraught with challenges. But challenges there would be. I feared that political divisions would only grow deeper. The factions that had emerged during my time in office between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans had already deepened into entrenched political ideologies. These factions had fought bitterly over the nature of government, and while I believed that such debates were necessary in a republic, I also feared that these divisions would eventually tear the country apart. The partisan rhetoric that had consumed our political discourse was only going to intensify, and I worried that it would lead to a breakdown of cooperation and unity. Even more pressing was the issue of westward expansion. The United States was growing rapidly, both in size and in population. We had already established our independence, but the question of how to manage this growing nation remained. How would we integrate new territories into the Republic? How would we balance the interests of the North and the South, the coastal states, and the interior? And most importantly, how would we ensure that the Republic's founding principles were upheld as we expanded westward? I knew that the United States would have to face these questions head-on. The balance between freedom and order, between the interests of different states, and between the forces of progress and tradition, would be tested. The question of slavery would continue to loom large, particularly as the nation expanded. The future of the Republic would be shaped not only by the political leaders of the day, but by the will of the people and the decisions they made. I could only hope that future generations would have the wisdom to navigate these challenges. But in the midst of these doubts and fears, I found a sense of peace in the fact that we had already laid the groundwork for something extraordinary. The Constitution, imperfect as it was, had established a framework for a government that could evolve and adapt to the changing needs of the nation. It provided a system of checks and balances, a way to keep power from becoming too concentrated in any one branch of government, and it enshrined the rights of the people. The Republic was not static, it was a living, breathing entity that could change as the times required. I took comfort in knowing that the Republic was grounded in principles that were greater than any one man or any one generation. The ideals of liberty, justice, and equality were not confined to a single moment in history. They were ideals that could continue to inspire people for centuries to come. Even in the face of internal strife, the United States could remain a symbol of hope for the oppressed, a beacon of light in a world often darkened by tyranny. And yet, I feared that this experiment in democracy could only succeed if the people remained vigilant. The United States was a republic founded on the idea that the people, not rulers, were the ultimate source of power. But if the people forgot that, if they allowed themselves to be swayed by the forces of factionalism and division, the republic could easily falter. It was up to the citizens of the United States to defend their rights, to uphold the rule of law, and to ensure that the principles of freedom and equality were not lost to the winds of time. In my final days, I thought often of the men and women who would carry the torch forward. What would they face? What burdens would they bear? I thought of my son, John Quincy Adams, and the future leaders of this young republic. The work we had begun would not be completed in our lifetime. It would fall to those who came after us to carry the ideals of the revolution into the future. I hoped that they would remain true to the vision we had set out, and that they would not lose sight of the importance of preserving the republic and its founding principles. But I also knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The United States would face new challenges I could not even imagine. But I had faith in the American people. I believed that, as long as they remained committed to the ideals of liberty and justice, they would rise to meet whatever obstacles lay before them. As I closed my eyes for the final time, I felt a sense of peace. The work we had begun was not finished, but it had been set on a course that would endure. The United States would continue, though I would not be there to witness it. The Republic was greater than any one man or any one generation. It was a living testament to the enduring power of freedom, and it would continue to grow, to evolve, and to fulfill the promise of liberty for all. As the days stretched into hours, I became ever more absorbed in the vast and unfolding story of our nation. A story that had begun with bold promises and high ideals, yet remained unfinished, constantly evolving. It was as though the very air around me was thick with the weight of what had been done and what still needed to be done. I had always believed that the greatest work we would leave behind was not in the laws we passed or the government we created, but in the idea of a government that could evolve and be tested by time. This idea, I knew, was now larger than any individual, including myself. But the question that troubled me most was, would the American experiment succeed in the long run, or would it become a fleeting moment in history? I thought back to the earliest days of our struggle, when we fought not just for independence, but for the opportunity to chart our own course. We had risen up against tyranny, and we had succeeded. But that success had only led to more profound questions. What kind of government would we build? What would we make of this hard-won freedom? And, more deeply, could this new republic endure the tests of time? Could it withstand the forces of faction, of ambition, of corruption? Though I had spent my years serving the new government in various capacities, Minister to France, Vice President, I now knew that the ultimate answer was not in any of those roles, but in the very nature of the Republic itself. What we had created was a delicate balance, one that required the constant participation of its citizens, their awareness of what was at stake. If the people were ever to forget the work it took to build the nation, if they were to take it for granted, then all that we had accomplished could slip away. In these quiet moments, I could feel the great weight of history bearing down on me. As much as I had given of myself to the cause, I knew that the Republic's survival would not be guaranteed by the actions of a few. It would not be enough for a handful of men, no matter how dedicated, to protect liberty. The survival of the Republic required a certain dedication from the citizens themselves. The system we had created, the Constitution, the checks and balances, the separation of powers, was a fragile thing. It was at best a framework. What we had built had been shaped not by accident but by a passionate belief that the people could govern themselves. But this belief was not something that could be taken for granted. I thought often of the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution. These were not just words on paper. They were a promise to future generations. Yet, in the same breath, I was aware that these words, beautiful and lofty, though they work, could be twisted, misinterpreted, and exploited by those who sought to consolidate power. Already, I could see the tensions that would inevitably arise as the Republic matured. The political factions that had appeared early in our Republic were already becoming entrenched, and the tensions between federalism and states' rights had only intensified. The very strength of the government we had established would, in time, be tested by those seeking to weaken it. Would the Republican spirit, the belief in liberty and justice, be enough to preserve the system we had created? My reflections led me to one unshakable truth, that the moral contradictions we had failed to resolve during the founding of the nation, chief among them, slavery, could not be ignored. Slavery was the great sin of the Republic, one that had been present since our earliest days. It was a contradiction that threatened to destroy the Republic from within, and it was one that I feared would cast a long shadow over the nation's future. The United States had been built on the principle that all men were created equal, yet millions were still held in bondage. Could we truly call ourselves a republic if some of our people were enslaved? This moral and political wound was one that I feared would never heal unless it was faced head-on. Even as I considered the great darkness of this contradiction, I was reminded of the extraordinary light of the American experiment. The ideas we had fought for, liberty, self-government, equality, were not just ours, they belonged to the world. Our revolution had set the stage for a global struggle for freedom. The world was watching as we built a republic founded on ideals that had never before been put into practice. And though the challenges of our republic were vast, I was still convinced that we had created something that would endure. The ideals of the American Revolution's self-determination, liberty, equality, had already begun to take root in other parts of the world. From France to Latin America, we had ignited the flames of revolution. But the future was uncertain. The path ahead would not be without its struggles. I had no illusions about the challenges that the Republic would face, challenges I could scarcely imagine. The forces of partisanship, the push for regional autonomy, the rise of economic divisions, they were all harbingers of difficulties that would test the nation. The issue of slavery would not go away. The question of territorial expansion would only intensify as the nation grew. The forces of political factionalism would continue to deepen. Despite these fears, I could not bring myself to despair, for I had lived through the birth of this nation. I had witnessed firsthand the resilience of the American spirit. We had fought and triumphed against the greatest of odds. We had built a nation from the ground up, a republic founded not on the will of a monarch, but on the will of the people. And I believed that as long as the American people held fast to the ideals of liberty and justice, they would rise to the occasion, whatever the future held. In my final reflections, I thought of the generations who would follow. The work of the revolution had never been about the few, but the many. It was not just about the founding fathers or the leaders who had guided the nation, but about the citizens who had come after us, who would have to carry the torch forward. My children, my grandchildren, they were not the heirs of a completed revolution, but of one still in progress. They would carry the responsibility of maintaining the Republic, of protecting it against forces that sought to tear it apart. I thought too of the Constitution, that fragile but essential document. It was a living thing, not static, not set in stone, but something that could be amended and adjusted to meet the needs of the times. It was not the perfect solution, but it was the best solution we had found. And in that document, in those ideals, lay the future of the Republic. As the darkness of death drew closer, I found myself not afraid, but at peace. I had done my part, and I had played a role in creating something that would last far beyond my lifetime. The work of the revolution was not finished, but the foundation had been laid. The American experiment, this fragile, imperfect, but enduring idea would continue. It would evolve, adapt, and face the challenges of time. And when the next generation of leaders rose to take the reins of power, it would be their responsibility, as it had been ours, to uphold the ideals of the revolution and protect the Republic from those who would seek to destroy it. And as I closed my eyes, I was certain of one thing. The United States was not just a nation. It was a beacon of hope to the world, a symbol of what could be achieved when men and women united under a common cause. It was a republic born of struggle, but one that could endure. The work of liberty was never done. but I was confident that the American people, no matter the trials ahead, would always rise to the challenge. I have left this world, but the republic I cherished still stands. It still shines under the sun, flowing through the annals of history, carrying the ideals of those who gave everything for its creation. I know that it will face storms, innumerable challenges, but it also holds a resilient power within it, one that we each work toward with such dedication. As I reflect on our early struggles, I remember that we fought not just for independence, but for the opportunity to chart our own course. We rose up against tyranny, and we succeeded. Yet that victory only led to deeper questions. What kind of government would we build? How would we make use of this hard-won freedom? And more profoundly, could this new republic endure the tests of time? Could it withstand the forces of faction, ambition, and corruption? Though I spent years in various roles, Minister to France, Vice President, Presidente, now realize that the ultimate answer lies not in any one of those positions, but in the very nature of the republic itself. What we created was a delicate balance, one that required the constant participation of its citizens, their awareness of what was at stake. If the people ever forgot the labor it took to establish this nation, if they took it for granted, then all that we accomplished could slip away unnoticed. In these quiet moments, I feel the weight of history pressing upon me. Despite everything I've given, I know the survival of the republic does not depend on the actions of a few. It is not enough for a handful of men, no matter how dedicated, to protect liberty. The survival of the republic requires the dedication of its citizens. The system we created, the Constitution, the separation of powers, the checks and balances is fragile. It is, at best, a framework. What we built was shaped not by chance, but by a passionate belief that the people could govern themselves. But that belief cannot be taken for granted. I often think about the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution. These were not just words on paper. They were promises made to future generations. Yet, in the same breath, I recognize that these words, beautiful and lofty as they are, can be twisted, misinterpreted, and exploited by those seeking to consolidate power. I can already see the tensions that will inevitably arise as the republic matures. The political factions that were formed early in our republic have only become more entrenched, and the divisions between federalism and states' rights have deepened. The very strength of the government we establish will, in time, be tested by those who seek to weaken it. The question is, will the ideals of the revolution, self-determination, liberty, and equality survive this test? I have also come to realize that the great moral contradiction we failed to resolve at the founding of the nation, slavery, will continue to haunt us. Slavery is the great sin of the republic, one that has been present since our earliest days. It is a contradiction that threatens to destroy the republic from within, and it is one that I fear will cast a long shadow over the nation's future. The United States was built on the principle that all men are created equal, yet millions of men and women remain in bondage. How can we truly call ourselves a republic when some of our people are enslaved? This moral and political wound must be healed, or it will lead to inevitable conflict. Beyond the issue of slavery, there are other challenges that I cannot ignore. The political divisions between the North and the South, between Federalists and Democratic Republicans, are only growing more entrenched. These divisions threaten to tear the nation apart, and I fear they will only deepen with time. The question of how to balance federal power with states' rights is far from settled. The government we created is not a perfect one, and the forces of faction and division will continue to test it. Yet even in the face of these challenges, I do not despair, for I have lived through the birth of this nation. I have seen firsthand the resilience of the American spirit. We fought and triumphed against the greatest of odds. We built a nation from the ground up, a republic, founded not on the will of a monarch, but on the will of the people. And I believe that as long as the American people hold fast to the ideals of liberty and justice, they will rise to the occasion, whatever the future holds. In my final reflections, I think of the generations that will follow. The work of the revolution was never about a few, it was always about the many. It was not about the founding fathers or the leaders who guided the nation, but about the citizens who will carry the responsibility forward. My children, my grandchildren, they will not complete the revolution, but they will carry it with them. They will face their own trials, their own challenges. But I believe that, in the end, the legacy of the revolution will endure. They will continue to shape a nation founded on liberty and justice. I also think about the Constitution, that fragile but essential document. It is a living thing, not static, not set in stone. It is something that can be amended and adapted as the times change. It is not perfect, but it is the best solution we have found. And in that document, in those ideals, lies the future of the republic. In my final days, I have come to understand that the revolution is not something that ends with us. It is something that will continue, something that will unfold over generations. The work we began is not done. The republic we created will have to be constantly defended, constantly nurtured. And I take comfort in the knowledge that, despite the challenges, the American experiment will continue. It will evolve, adapt, and face the challenges of the future. And when the next generation of leaders steps forward to take the reins of power, it will be their responsibility, as it was ours, to uphold the ideals of the revolution and protect the republic from those who would seek to destroy it. As I close my eyes, I know that the United States is not just a country. It is a beacon of hope for the world, a symbol of what can be achieved when men and women unite under a common cause. It is a republic born of struggle, but one that can endure. The work of liberty is never done, but I am confident that the American people will always rise to the challenge.